Max and or Azad, do you want to say a little something about the first session of a new topic?
So welcome everyone to our new series called HPS, doing HPS, challenges, approaches, reflections, blah blah blah. So the idea Max had, and I really like this idea, is that to have something like integrated HPS or gray zone where no one can understand whether it's history of philosophy or history of philosophy or philosophy or history of science. And to try to have, at the same time, the talks which will be like cases of this kind of stuff. Some people in this room like to do, and others as well. And more explicit methodological or theoretical reflections on how we should do history and philosophy of science. And I think today it's a mix of both, and it's our pleasure to have Charles Wolfe from Université de Toulouse, who will be talking about Georges Canguilhem and his project of biological philosophy.
Thank you, Azad. It's a pleasure to be here and honored to be here. My first time in Louvain-la-Neuve, and to see some brilliant and nice people that I knew, even a little bit, and others that I'm just meeting. This is the most echo-resonant whiteboard I've ever experienced in my life.
That very unnerving experience of listening to yourself talk.
So I'm going to be talking about Georges Canguilhem. I almost put the dates, but I'm horrible at dates. But you know, his life and career is actually fairly long. His professional life extends over a big chunk of the 20th century. He, as a young man in the 20s, is already active in various circles, including political circles, which he then kind of minimizes that obvious aspect in his mature career, and he's still publishing bits and pieces of stuff, let's say, by the 80s, and so it's like you have a 50-60 year stretch occupying, if not the long 20th century, you know, the short 20th century or something. And he was a resistant, which has been studied. Like all true heroes, he was actually extremely modest about whatever he did. It seems that he did a fair bit in the Resistance, which is not irrelevant for some of the things I'm going to talk about today, because the article focus on today contains some rather surprising, I don't want to spoil the most dramatic part of the article, as it were, but the notes sur la situation faite à la biologique, a very strange title. In fact, a full title, if I can get it right. Notes sur la situation faite en France à la philosophie biologique. The kind of title today, the article would be rejected by whatever big journal you submit it to. It's like note on is already, don't do that really anymore, but Notes sur la situation faite en France à la philosophie biologique, published in 1947. 1947, if you stop and think about it for a second, it's like still the smoking ruins of World War II. Even without peer review, as it tends to be the case in French journals, we could imagine it had to be written at least 6 months or 9 months. So it's like the article produced and published freshly after World War II. And I said the fact that he was in the resistance is not irrelevant because the article contains some surprising love letter-ish moments towards a Germanic tradition against a French tradition. So Notes sur la situation faite en France is a kind of dramatic rhetorical self-criticism, not of him as an individual, but it's like we in France are behind. We in France are not doing certain things. Specifically, we in France are not, we are against philosophie biologique. And so then the question is, well, what is that? And he doesn't do much definition, positive definition in the article. He does a lot of negative, as in like, it's because of him and her and him and their respective philosophical prejudices or ideologies that we're blocked in doing philosophie biologique. So Canguilhem, I failed to get his dates, but I gave an approximation of his dates. He's famous, well, he's really famous for two things. He's famous on the one hand, and perhaps more secondly than the first thing, as a major figure of epistemology, of the French version, often called historical epistemology in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Well, there's debates, including a famously violent paper by Alexandre's compatriot Yves Jean-Jaurès on what historical epistemology even means, if it's a legitimate research program. But Canguilhem is a giant in the project of epistemology in the 20th century, whether you like it or not. It's a fact. Secondly, and roughly corresponding to this, maybe, he's the author of one particularly well-known book, which is not the easiest thing to read, which is Le Normal et le Pathologique, The Normal and the Pathological, first published as his medical thesis, 1943, speaking of the war, and then augmented, but like really augmented, in 1966. It goes from being a short book to a normal length book, so it doubles in size. And I'm not going to especially talk about that book today. That book is of interest to the excessively large number of people who like to deal with issues of normativity and naturalism and normativity. And it's, of course, I shouldn't want to say of course, in the updated version, in the new version of the book, the full version, it's 1966, which is to say he has, to his credit, and unlike other philosophers of life in the continental tradition in the 20th century, in the Germanic tradition, he's taken on the sort of genetic and molecular turn, not as some terrible, scary event, but as nouvelle connaissance de la vie. I think that's the phrase he uses. It's like, Georges Canguilhem, have been interested in different forms of connaissance de la vie, in Claude Bernard, and in Darwin, and in William Harvey. And here we are, 1950s, 1960s, we're confronted with, we need to kind of understand a nouvelle connaissance de la vie. So that's just a kind of background to who he is. And like I said, today, and in the article that I recently published, I'm interested in this weird article, which I think is it's a great piece, and it's a little bit of a standalone, I mean, it is a standalone piece, but it's, for example, the category philosophie biologique. I mentioned a minute ago that he doesn't do much explaining or definition of it. It's also true, and I haven't fully tried to track the term, but I have tried a bit now and then. He sort of drops the expression, as far as I can tell. So it's he takes it really seriously in this piece, but then he probably thinks, okay, I'm going to try this from different angles, including he becomes more of a historicist. But now I'm doing meta-reflection on a paper that I haven't yet given. But as I think presumably everyone here knows, epistemology in the French sense has a relatively strongly historical component. Even when they are a bit presentist or positivist in the sense they're studying something like scientific truth. So Canguilhem sometimes says there's no notion of truth for philosophy. Truth is a scientific notion. But we'll be interested in the kind of historical forms that those things take. It's possible that the philosophie biologique as a project gets to some extent replaced by a more historicist project. But okay, with all those elements of context or prelude being given, and I could apologize for not doing a PowerPoint, I often do, but sometimes I do talk and hand out, and maybe Louvain à Neuve brought out the old-fashioned behavior. Charles, I mean, if I say Charles in this case, I mean me, not him. I'm going to speak today about a little-known article on biological philosophy by someone who's not an unknown, Georges Canguilhem. In my experience, philosophers of biology, unless they were close to people like Gaillon or Reinberger, don't read him much or have a vague awareness of the normal and the pathological and watered-down ideas about norms and normativity as statistical, less reductionist, etc. Actually, he has a significant, on the one hand, more scholarly or historical, like what I was just saying, historical epistemology, and on the other hand, more like philosophy of medicine. So I could, this sort of, I'm not saying these are synonyms or philosophe de la médecine, whatever. what you find in the normal and the pathological and a set of related papers over the next 10, 20, 30 years of his career, dealing with doctor-patient relations, dealing with health, that part of his work. Call that philosophy of medicine, too. My text for today doesn't really belong to either of these, as we will see. For more on Canguilhem on this general topic, but not on this text, see the volume that relatively recently came out from Springer in the series I co-edited, in a volume that I co-edited called Canguilhem and Continental Philosophy of Biology. And on this actual text, I think you've received my little paper. And luckily, I didn't claim that Revue Internationale de Philosophie was a Louvain journal, but originally it is a Belgian francophone-based journal, right? Where is it based, Revue Internationale de Philosophie? No one knows.
I'm not sure.
Okay, well, that's all right.
Maybe it's Brussels.
Brussels. Biological life as a philosophical object has been discussed in various traditions over the course of the 20th, 21st centuries. Some of these traditions, like that which crystallized in the 1960s to form the field of philosophy of biology, are very much with us today. These are, active professional subdisciplines, even if they are memorialized and prodded with Google Ngrams, etc., by Gaillon and Pradeux in recent decades, studying how these disciplines have crystallized, what got marginalized, etc., etc. So much for philosophy of biology. Other labels like biophilosophy, biological philosophy, etc., or lebenspphilosophy, seem to be objects of history. They didn't survive as projects and funding and professorial chairs and whatnot. Although you will find people, kind of holdouts, who will say, no, we are a minority tendency in a world dominated by something, something, something. We do something like, so for example, people who are partisans of Simondon in that way, they'll say, yeah, we understand that each year there aren't 10 people like us being hired, but that doesn't mean we're a dead tradition. It just means we're a minority tradition. And you can have this experience if you go to a meeting of inactivists. In their case, there's some money involved, and there's perhaps a circular citation loop, but they can say we are a micro-community in a bigger, badder world of other people. With regard to the question of these labels or traditions in philosophy of biology, a typical fault line is Darwinism, not saying anything very new or original. That is, defenders of a philosophy of life typically distinguish themselves from a more Darwinian and, in their view, more reductionist approaches in mainstream philosophy of biology, despite the attempts by Ernst Mayr once upon a time to not allow for that duality. Another fault line is naturalism, in the sense that some trends in biological philosophy refuse to take their coordinates from mainstream biology, or indeed any biology, while others front-load what they're calling biological with concepts like subjectivity or first-person science. So I hope you see what I mean. So some people are sort of stridently anti-naturalistic, and others say, no, we're naturalists, but subjectivity is basic in the world of nature. In a rarely discussed paper published shortly after the end of World War II, a time when romantic biology in the Germanic tradition was not welcome with open arms, so to speak, entitled Note sur la situation faite en France et la philosophie biologique, untranslated so far, Canguilhem called for a biological philosophy, which he felt had been prevented from emerging by the dominant French Cartesian tradition. Similar calls for a non-reductionist, more Germanic-centered approach to these questions were made in the English-speaking world some decades later by Marjorie Green, notably. Green occupied an unusual position as, I'm sure some people here know very well, as a sort of a official co-founder of philosophy of biology as a discipline, and as a chief representative in the English-speaking world of the more continental trend. So, Green deserves more attention. She started to get some. Philipp Honenberger, including in the Canguilhem volume I co-edited, has paper on Marjorie Green, but she deserves more attention. And one can indeed sort of look at Canguilhem and Green as instances in the, 40s, 50s, 60s of this sort of other way of doing philosophy of biology. I focus on this explicitly programmatic 1947 paper here in order to understand what he was calling for and what form this genre or subdiscipline might have taken had he continued to work explicitly in this direction. And like I said a few minutes ago, he didn't really continue to use the term afterwards, but it's also possible to view le normal et le pathologique as a piece of philosophie biologique. It's, you say in French, ça se défend, like you could defend the case that work instantiates the program. Like we can discuss that. I want to note that I think it's important to note that there isn't just one monolithic form of continental philosophy of biology. In the work of thinkers such as Canguilhem and Green, it would be a bit of a stretch to call it a tradition, the concept of organism is crucial, inasmuch as it serves as a kind of biological analog for self or subjectivity, depending on which vocabulary it favors. Figures such as Jakob von Uexküll and Kurt Goldstein are very important here, as they also were, I'm just mentioning this for people who are interested in these things, in the rather unhappy foray into philosophy of biology done by Heidegger in his lecture course of 1929-1930, Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where there's a lot of Uexküll and so forth. Does Canguilhem want to reintroduce the subject into biology? Because that could be a possible meaning for biological philosophy. Again, a philosophical reflection on biology which doesn't take its coordinates from mainstream reductionist biology. We actually should be careful not to treat his thought in overly subjectivist or anthropocentric terms, given that what he elsewhere calls vital normativity is a property of living beings in general, not just sentient or self-reflexive beings. And as he sometimes says fairly explicitly, the real issue for him is what's vital, not what's human. I mean, what he's interested in is applicable to earthworms and perhaps tardigrades, not just to special primates, whatever. In his essay on vitalism, which I think also got shared, this great paper on vitalism, and here we finally come to a quote in the handout, Canguilhem emphasizes, quote 1, "We should not expect much from a biology fascinated by the prestige of the physico-chemical sciences." So we should not expect much from a biology fascinated by the prestige of the physico-chemical sciences. So it's quite a bold positioning. It's not I'm anti-science, and it's not I'm anti-biology. It's I'm not going to take my marching orders from the type of biology that takes its coordinates, as I was saying before, from the physico-chemical sciences. And the quote continues, "A reduced biology has as its corollary the effacement of the biological object as such," etc., etc. So it's an interesting moment because it's not, depending on what we mean by naturalism, this seems like one of those moments where the philosopher is still wanting a degree of self-control or authority over the space that he or she is dealing with and saying, I don't need to be dictated to what the truth is by a reductionist biology. And in le normal et le pathologique, you have a slightly different oppositional situation. The bad guy is biology overall, so to speak. The good guy is medicine, and the trick is to say medicine shouldn't be completely controlled by biology, which is reductive. So in this piece, it's an interesting duality. There's a good way of relating to biology, or a good way that biology teaches us stuff, and then a way that he's refusing. And so similar point from Note sur la situation, that's quote 2. Let's not even speak of most biologists, see, most biologists, for whom le vivant is nothing but a physical object whose determinism is not in question, blah, 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 blah. So we can say, I'm trying to help him out in what his argument is. We can say that he's trying to articulate a more holistic form of inquiry into life. And if you say, okay, but holistic, how? What does that mean? So far, it seems to be meaning placing the living subject at the center of biological inquiry. And as I said, some people think that has to mean a human subject. In Canguilhem's case, less so. Although another point I could put here is he, for example, doing philosophie biologique, or is he a humanist? And there are times in his work, not in this article, but there are times in his work overall, where he seems to be defending for example, when he's talking about the patient, the doctor-patient relationship, there it's not earthworms or salamanders that seem to be possibly the issue, it's the human patient. But we can allow Canguilhem a bit of wiggle room on that issue, because it could be contextual, situational, right? If you're dealing with something like how medicine deals with patients, we don't necessarily have to demand of the philosopher that they're a consistent, hyper physicalistico, naturalistico, vitalist who's just concerned with properties of life in the physical universe, period. But that's a long parenthesis. Canguilhem is not, so I kind of asked this rhetorically shortly before, and I'm answering and saying he's not necessarily one of those theorists who wants to reintroduce the subject into biology at all costs. As some people say, infusing subjectivity into life, like Goldstein probably is one of those people. He was a big admirer of Goldstein, and that's been studied by Jean-Jaurès, by yours truly, by others. It's not clear that his call for a biological philosophy that would be different from some other approaches to the phenomenon of life, it's not clear that that's at its core a plea for reinscribing subjectivity in life. So unlike, say, Hegel, for whom organism is the first real form of a subject, quoting Hegel, the process of subjectivity, of self-relation in an outer world. So Hegel's philosophy of nature has lots of stuff about how the organism, animal organism, is a sort of crude early version of what subjectivity is, because an organism is already in a kind of inner-outer relation to a milieu, to an environment, so to speak. Canguilhem, turning in more detail to the article, speaks of a mistrust, I quote him, mistrust and hostility towards biological philosophy in France. And he traces in what amounts to the real beginning after a few pages of stuff. He traces this hostility back to the rationalist tradition of Cartesian philosophy, the mechanistic dimension, because Descartes bequeathed to modernity and to French thought, in Canguilhem's view, a mechanistic theory that neglects the originality of life, what Canguilhem calls its ontological originality, because living beings are reduced to explainable in mechanical, mechanistic terms. Quote 3, this is an important quote, I think, from the article. Because of Descartes rather than since Descartes, it's a strange phrase also in French, I come back to it. Because of Descartes rather than since Descartes, biological philosophy is viewed in our country as a rather suspicious kind of speculation. Life in the Cartesian system is not granted any ontological originality. So, because of Descartes rather than since Descartes, I think what he means is, I'm not just making a history of philosophy point about someone who lived in the 17th century in a certain world and context. I'm not just talking about his problem in that little world. I'm talking about a problem that guy left us with, a bit like, the mind-body problem, as it were. It's Descartes' fault, but it's a live problem in 1947 and perhaps in 2025. And so he uses this relatively strong phrase that in the Cartesian system, life is not granted any ontological originality. In our vocabulary, we'd probably say ontological specificity. And so there's a first hint of what philosophie biologique is supposed to be doing. It's negative, but like I said, we can try and turn some of these negatives into positives. And we could say, okay, philosophie biologique wants to grant life some form of ontological originality. Whatever that means, let's put that down on the list. Indeed, most of the article is constructed on the basis of a set of oppositions, at least a basic opposition between biological philosophy and a set of contraries. First Cartesianism, then rationalism in different forms, including the Marxism of the time. Parenthesis about the Marxism. I suffered considerably in midsummer producing a chapter with the part on Canguilhem and Marx, and so now it's a bit like being, world famous in Poland. I'm one of 2 or 3 hopefully, world authorities on this strange little topic of Canguilhem and Marx. What I mean to say is, in this article, he's very hostile to a certain form, which I guess is something in the French communist thought of that time. He's not always so hostile. There's a lot of interesting earlier papers by him on labor, travail and on technology and so forth, which show a fairly serious investment in Marx's text, which some random conservative thinker, I think, is not going to bother putting that level of effort. So that's one thing. Much later in his career, when he and the infamous Althusser are they're not at their respective peaks because it's quite late in Canguilhem's career, but in the 70s, they have some kind of friendly exchange. They send each other their best students. Althusser tells, some of these students grew up by now old men or dead men, and wrote all sorts of things about this, saying Althusser told us you have to go to Canguilhem's lectures, it's crucial you understand epistemology. And Canguilhem put out his final, I think it is his final book, with the word ideology in the title. So he borrowed a notion of ideology from Althusser. So just to say that the rather bitter, tense relation to Marxism in this article doesn't hold for his thought in general. So Cartesianism, rationalism, Marxism, to some extent it's almost like it's one mistake. It's a mistake with different contexts and forms. Quote number 4, taken literally and in a strict sense, à la lettre en toute rigueur, rationalism, the philosophy of the wise man, ends up making, sorry for his gendered language, making man lose sight of the fact that he's a living being. And similar to what I just said about Marxism, there are other texts, I think actually even in this article once or twice, he sort of says, I'm a rationalist too. I don't let these self-proclaimed rationalists tell me what a rationalist has to be. So sometimes he can say, no, rationalism is a desirable thing, but understood a bit differently. As I've already mentioned, that thus the article, rather than giving a lot of positive content to what philosophie biologique means, does a lot of negative stuff. So when I quoted before the ontological originality bit, I was saying that we can put down to understand what biological philosophy should be. It should be granting life ontological originality. He also says, quote, life is a specific metaphysical object, objet métaphysique propre. And so I'm just having these noted down as I slowly try and, systematize them or give them some meaning. And so in my prelude, I said something about how, bear in mind, this comes out shortly after World War II, written by someone who was active in the resistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because here we come, and it's the long quote, quote 5, we come to the Godwin point moment in his article, because he's being sarcastic about, this fear of, he calls it mystical irrationalism. So he's saying like these guys, whether Cartesians, other rationalists, Marxists, they're afraid of some kind of mystical irrationalism, and they think philosophie biologique is a good specimen of this mystical irrationalism. And here comes the Godwin point. Let's see. Read the whole thing. It was enough that German philosophy, especially in the 19th century, showed more complacency towards life than French philosophy has done since 1870, so I guess the Franco-Prussian War. For biological philosophy to appear in France as, and this is a great phrase, I translated it as ominous growth, louche excroissance, on the surface of positive science, right? So positive science means he's alluding to positivism. So German philosophy / philosophie biologique appears as this horrible war to growth on the surface of proper science, capable of serving the most shameful, moins avouable, political or social ends. And then he starts to really get funny. He says, I'm not going to name names of people who think this stuff. They will recognize themselves, and the informed reader can put names under this description. So if you're curious, one of the people I think he means is Georges Politzer, who's pretty forgotten today, but was a very important communist thinker and actually scholar of psychology who was executed by the Nazis at the Mont Valérien in 1943. He was a very active militant and became a kind of martyr for the French Communist Party, but at this point in time is not viewed as a friend, as it were, by Canguilhem. Lukács, for those of you interested in serious Marxist thought, here's a funny thing. Canguilhem can't mean Lukács because Lukács published a book 5 years after this article. Probably one of his less good books, one of his worst books. Published a book called The Destruction of Reason, which is exactly what Canguilhem is describing. It's like a very ideological attack on all philosophies of life, and I think Lukács says that people like Hitler are an outgrowth of a process that I think, so obviously Nietzsche, but I think he goes back to Schelling and maybe Hegel as this sort of endless series of increasingly irrationalist philosophies, which are then guilty, producing, you know, the Third Reich. But Canguilhem says, I won't name names, etc., but you will recognize these thinkers, I go back to the quote, who are prompt to denounce in any work of biological philosophy an aberration to be located somewhere between mysticism, romanticism, and fascism, a kind of naive, unhealthy, or criminal speculation whose typical representatives are named according to the case Hegel, Nietzsche, Bergson, or Hitler. There you go. That's, I believe I'm entitled to say Godwin point. And it's quite a list, right? Hegel, Nietzsche, Bergson, or Hitler. It's like, whoa, okay, that's either, in this case, I suppose my little game of saying, let's turn the negative into the positive doesn't work so well because I'm not sure I want to say philosophical biology, philosophie biologique, rather. Should be instantiated by Hegel, Nietzsche, Bergson, or Hitler. I think there he's saying these are what these horrible dogmatic people that I'm trying to kind of loosen up or shoot down, this chape de plomb, you know, this weight, the dogma that we have to deal with in France if we want to do this stuff. So I'm not a rigorous sociologist of ideas. I'm not Christoph Scheringa or whatever, but it's curious. It's not just, oh, he was a resistant, he's not a fascist, therefore it's okay, let him talk. That's not the only thing I'm saying. I'm saying it's a curious point because he's really saying this Germanic tradition is where we want to go. It's what we have to learn from and somehow extend. And the Cartesian rationalist Marxist comfort zone of 1947 France is, well, it's not a comfort zone for him. So the question then is, well, what is he speaking in favor of? What's this project supposed to be? Well, so in that quote, you can get the indication, not just from the Hegel, Nietzsche, Bergson, Hitler list, but the beginning of that quote. You can get the hint that there's a kind of embrace of romanticism in the German sense. And so Canguilhem in 1947, you could say, is, can one echo 50 years in advance? Maybe you don't say echo. He's prefiguring books that some people here read as graduate students, I know for a fact. Books like Robert Richards' The Romantic Sense of Life, that's what it's called, right? But in the past 20 years, it's become a big scholarly theme to reevaluate the contribution of Romanticism to the sciences. It's a thing in itself. I have my own mixed feelings about that trend, including as a scholar of Vitalism, which is like a rival sport or something, but regardless of my feelings about it, Canguilhem, where his antennae are quivering in favor of, seemed similar to this kind of return to Naturphilosophie, return to Romanticism. Brand new book in the past year by, oh no, I'm not going to remember his name. That book came up in our Woods Hole meeting as at the book on romantic biology.
Rubik, I forgot his first name.
Exactly, Rubik.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I've read a chapter of this.
Yeah. So Robert Richards 25 years ago, Rupik 6 months ago, and a few books in between. It's a thing. It's also there in the kind of Lenny Moss style return to normativity. And then one could say, well, is that really what Canguilhem wants? But I don't think Canguilhem really wants or really is talking about taking one's coordinates from Hegel or Schelling or Oken or other, Naturphilosophie figures. He's also not, either here or elsewhere, defending teleology against mainstream mechanistic science. He doesn't do a lot of the other predictable moves or, obsessive moves that you would find in this kind of romanticism-focused philosophy/scholarship. So let me ask the question again. What is the positive content of this philosophie biologique? Well, I think what he means by that is exemplified in works such as Goldstein's Der Aufbau des Organismus, the structure of the organism, and his own Normale et Pathologique. So Goldstein's book, which I think he discovered during the war, circa early 40s, not that it matters right now in this room. Goldstein's book is from the mid-30s, and I think Canguilhem discovered it in the early 40s. And Le Normale et Pathologique is first, 1943, first version, and so that's before this article. Goldstein's book and Canguilhem's book are studies of vital phenomena which seek to take into account the subjective or autopoietic or world-making capacities of organisms rather than treating them simply as, mechanisms for shorthand. Life on this view, on the kind of Goldstein-Canguilhem philosophie biologique view, life is a kind of creation, a transformation or sublimation of risks and catastrophic reactions. And he says that in the article. Reason, with a capital R, can be disconcerted, as he says, by this capacity of life. As he wrote in a very different place, La vie déconcerte la logique. Life disconcerts logic. And, we could talk about that quote. It's an intriguing quote. In this article, he writes in a way that's a lot more lyrical, whether we like that style or not. A lot more lyricism than we find elsewhere in his work, mostly. This is quote 6. It's undeniable that life is a rather disturbing object of thought for reason. Reason is lucidity and rectitude. In the eyes of reason, life is murky. By the straight lines of reason, life is lucid. Reason is regular like an accountant. Life is anarchic like an artist. I mean, that's dandyism, Nietzscheanism. It sounds, in a way, a little bit, I say this tongue-in-cheek, anarchiste de droite for francophone. There's a little, I think, a little bit of that going on there. But he does a few of these, those forms of pushbacks against rationalism, including it leads him to say stuff that's historically completely bogus or completely not worthy of his work in general. So he quotes the famous statement by Bichat, by Xavier Bichat, La vie est l'ensemble des forces qui résistent à la mort. Life is the set of forces that resist death. And he says, these rationalists are saying vitalism and life is irrational, but Bichat's statement, that's on the side of the revolution. And I mean, that's just a weird connection. There's no particular connection between the medico-physiological theory of Bichat, unless there's something I'm missing. We don't have Philippe Humann here to set me straight. But so Canguilhem's language sounds vitalistic in a kind of broad cultural sense. Indeed, the sense that some rationalist commentators would associate with Nietzsche and Bergson, not to mention worse names, namely a doctrine of vitality, the evaluation of cultural, social, and maybe even moral norms in terms of vitality and morbidity. So all of us are too young to remember that time in European culture, but some of us are old enough to have read books about that time in European culture, the sort of 1920s, 30s, 40s, where vitalism acquires some of its bad reputation, not the vitalism that Francis Crick or whoever are making fun of. So not Hans Driesch, Bergson, but the vitalism viewed as a sort of politically, socially, ethically dangerous doctrine saying, life is what judges of all norms. And so health and sickness as applied to society. You know the story, I think. And so when Canguilhem is saying, life is like an artist, ce que la vie contient d'invention, it sounds quite Nietzschean. I'm not saying it necessarily sounds Nietzschean in the worst sense that can mean, but there's something, and he's not shy about sometimes embracing a kind of Nietzschean heritage in some of these texts. And Foucault has a very beautiful paper in homage to Canguilhem where he plays up the Nietzschean heritage too. So we could describe philosophie biologique as a kind of vitalism, but does that really answer the question what it is? Because in that case, one is describing an ambiguous term by another slightly ambiguous term. In his essay Aspects of Vitalism, which I sent around, which is roughly contemporary with this article, by the way, because it's lectures given in 1946, 1947 first, Canguilhem offers the somewhat imagistic definition, quote 7, a vitalist, I would suggest, is someone who is led to reflect on the nature of life, more because of the contemplation of an egg than because she has handled a hoist or a bellows. So a vitalist is someone who's motivated, sort of cognitively, theoretically, scientifically motivated, by contemplating, embryogenesis and whatever, rather than another type of thinker, scientist, theorist, whose cognitive motivation is, look at how that windmill or watch or gun works, how interesting, the structure, interrelation of components is. It's a fair suggestion, and it's a fair comment about the impact of generation / development / embryogenesis on biology in general and sort of vitalistic ideas in particular. And it's, by the way, a fairly demystifying definition, because by giving that statement, that definition, Canguilhem is ruling out mysterious vital forces. He's saying, look, a vitalist is observing a certain part of living nature and says, that's what I want to get a PhD on to write about. I'm motivated by that. That definition still leaves out a lot. It leaves out his own reflections on what I've sometimes wanted to call a more existential vitalism, which is to say, the sort of Goldstein and Canguilhem theme that what it means to be an organism is a certain way of existing. It's not just a way of synthesizing proteins or a way of metabolizing. It's a certain way of, as I think he says at some point, a point of view. So to be an organism means having a point of view on other organisms. So interestingly, that definition that I just quoted also doesn't really give us the ontological originality of life. So if we remember that that's what Canguilhem is kind of wanting, he seems to be skirting around that question. Now, recall also that biological philosophy was supposed to be independent to some degree of biology itself. Because as I was mentioning to some nice people at lunch, and here's this reference, which is not, however, in the handout. In some other texts, he warns against suspending the critical, experimental, logical constraints of the scientific project and falling into subjectivist philosophy of life. So in a late text on health, on the notion of health, which is not his greatest piece, but it has this great moment for me in it, he quotes a little bit of Merleau-Ponty, very subjectivist little passage by Merleau-Ponty on my body, health is my truth, my experience. And Canguilhem says something, whether in French or in translation, a bit sinuous, but basically what he's saying is, it would be lovely if this were true, but I can't really endorse what Merleau-Ponty is saying, because logic and science must remain as my garde-fou. He uses a fairly strong term in French, garde-fou, so that there are limits, constraints posed by logic and science to how far one wants to go and saying, health is just my own positing of myself, and so forth. So there are times where Canguilhem is pretty explicit. It's saying, no, I don't want to sign away all forms of logico-scientific authority. I explicitly don't want to do that. Here he seems to be saying, I don't want philosophie biologique to be dictated to by biology fascinated by the prestige of the physico-chemical sciences. But he doesn't produce a theory of life or organism or embodiment as somehow other than this world of physical nature. He never does that. I mean, take my word for it, as it were. And here's a good piece of evidence for what I'm saying. Quote 8, and this is from his text on vitalism. The classical vitalist, and he's criticizing a certain form of vitalism, which he calls le vitaliste classique. The classical vitalist grants that living beings belong to a physical environment, yet asserts that they are an exception to physical laws. And here the language is pretty strong. Canguilhem says, this is the inexcusable philosophical mistake in my view. It's funny that he says philosophical, because you think it's a sort of inexcusable scientific mistake. But to him, a major error has been made when someone says living beings are un empire dans un empire. He borrows the famous Spinozist phrase, that they are a kingdom within a kingdom, which is to say they have their own laws separate from the general laws that affect the physical universe. And he really doesn't like that idea. We can, take his word for it. There's a sort of naive dualism there. And I think, as I mentioned with regard to his criticism of Merleau-Ponty, I think he doesn't like the idea of sort of transcendentalizing the living subject to boost it outside of the world of science. So, coming towards a conclusion, biological philosophy is not a species of classic vitalism. I didn't take more time to go into the fact that there's other forms of vitalism for him, but we saw what he thinks of classic vitalism. Biological philosophy is not particularly a species of phenomenology of embodiment. If it's a species of vitalism, well, it's of a weaker kind. Seeks to do justice to properties like vital normativity, which indeed are properties not found in galaxies or atoms or protons. So vital normativity belongs to certain entities. And Claude Bernard is a pretty good instantiation of what Canguilhem means here, because Bernard spends a lot of time theorizing determinism, being a really good reductionist, a cruel experimenter and everything. And then in the same breath, sort of is like, and these properties are unique to the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder that I'm studying here. They're not properties found in a piece of rock and so forth. And of course, parenthesis, within the parenthesis, Bernard gets terrified by the implications, you see it in his notebooks more, that he's defending vitalism. And so it's like, well, no, everything's deterministic and scientific, but it's sort of what we might call kind of weak vitalism going on. Biological philosophy, à la Canguilhem, is not a strictly delimited field. It clearly goes in a different direction from either mainstream continental denial of the relevance of biology to philosophy, because when I was talking about continental this and that, let's not forget that especially in his time, and perhaps still now, there's a whole chunk of the continental tradition that would just say, oh, quelle horreur, we don't want to touch science at all. And perhaps life science even worse in some ways than, physics or mathematics. So A, he's definitely not doing that. B, he's not doing or calling for sort of another version of continental biophilosophy a la Jonas. And I mentioned that he has no particular hostility to Darwinism in his work, and when he engages with those topics, there's no combat d'arrière-garde. There's no trying to push back some sort of big trend that he thinks philosophy should be pushing back in. Now, if we consider a familiar opposition between strong and weak conceptions of organism, here recalling a lovely meeting on organicism, Woods Hall, where Azat and I met, in that distinction, the weak conception of organism just holds that organisms are types of organization with some specific features, like homeostasis, like my Claude Bernard example. And the strong conception would insist on some kind of irreducible uniqueness of organisms and challenge all the scientific world picture based on that idea. The defender of the strong concept of organism indeed inherits a sort of romantic science program. Not anti-science, but very hubristically, you might say, saying modern science, mechanistic science, scientific revolution science is somehow not enough or is misguided and we need to do something else. I think someone like Jonas is a good example of that kind of attitude. And in a lovely quote, sorry if some people already know it, but I think most people don't here. This is quote 9, in a lovely, funny, it's an anecdote actually, quotation, Huxley quotes an exchange he had with J.S. Haldane, and it's a bit hard to do the joke of what he means orally. It's a bit of a written joke in a sense, because Huxley says Dr. Haldane called himself an organicist, which implied being anti-mechanist and yet not a mystic vitalist. See, there you have again that situation. This is Huxley, I never quite grasped what he really meant. As I was describing some experiment which demanded a mechanistic explanation, he burst out, as a Haldane, with, but it's a norganism, my dear young fellow, a norganism. So the word written begins with the letter N, as if there's some mysterious thing called norganism. And okay, it's British and it's little humor, gentlemanly humor and stuff, but that's Huxley is, I guess, conveying the idea that Haldane is saying, like, your mechanistic explanations can't do justice to this thing because it's something over and above. And don't really get that from Canguilhem. He's not trying to do a metaphysics of life, organism. He's not trying to do counter-science. To use a very familiar Straussonian distinction, he's not proposing a revisionary metaphysics of organism. So, philosophie biologique is not a revisionary metaphysics of organism. At the same time, I'm not sure that he's content with a weak sense, with a descriptive sense. One reason why philosophie biologique doesn't take its coordinates fully from biology or a more mechanistic biology is the sort of trace of humanism, which is, you can see in his writings on doctor-patient relation, but also his very polemical, famous paper on psychology, where he gets angry at the way certain sciences or pseudosciences encroach upon what people are and what people should be, the sort of pseudo-normative dimension in the case of psychology, you know, sort of where he kind of says it's basically just criminology, psychology. I'll skip some, because I don't think they're that interesting, some points about normativity and what normativity is. It's also better known, I think, from Canguilhem. I skip, but I'm happy to talk about the possibility that his vitalism has something Kantian about it, which is to say, rather than being a naive objectivist metaphysics, what I also call existential, that he allows for some degree of construction, that life, this is the kind of Uxkulian side of Canguilhem, life is about constructing meaning. Life is about picking out certain features and ignoring others as you sort of make your, you know, you make your Umwelt, so to speak. And he has a fairly serious engagement with the work of Uxkul, by the way. And I have a paper forthcoming in one of those strange biosemiotics volumes on Uxkul, Goldstein, and Canguilhem on the idea that organisms are meaning makers. Yeah, I had a point which I think I will also skip, in 1 minute or 2 minutes left before 3 o'clock, where in the article there's a very strange passage. Well, there's a passage where he uses a very mysterious expression, and I could never really get anyone of the Canguilhemians to really fully clarify it, and it's in quote 10, where he, I think the context I was putting all this bit in is what I was calling a more civilizational emphasis, that he actually in this article, which is rare in his work, gets kind of civilizational level, where he's sort of saying, philosophie biologique, let me just paraphrase all of this and say, he seems to be suggesting, in a kind of proto-ecological way actually, philosophie biologique could steer us away from the excessively machiniste, machinique dominance of where our civilization is going, the sort of industrial civilization of machines. And he has this kind of, I guess it's a Bergsonian reference, and I'm not a big Bergson person, where he says, the one good thing Bergson, you know, has taught us is to understand the true relationship of organism and mechanism. And Canguilhem says what we need is a philosophie biologique du machinisme, treating machines as the organs of life, and here's the mysterious phrase, laying the foundations of a general organology. So what is organologie générale? In very, very rough terms, let's say, it's what I just said a second ago. Instead of placing the mechanical level first and saying, oh, organisms are a kind of special case of the mechanical story, it's like, oh, let's put, but that's the thing, I'm not really sure in detail what that's supposed to mean, that putting organism first and then the mechanical second. So even if we or I don't clearly see how we're supposed to do general organology today, although as I said, you could probably fill in an ecological dimension in that claim, which he doesn't, but you could probably fill it in there. Even if we don't see exactly how to do that today, even if we find this business about life and reason to be a bit dated, you know, maybe of intellectual interest, but dated, I would like to suggest, or I'd like to claim that his 1947 essay has something noteworthy. For one thing, because it calls explicitly for a kind of disciplinary shift, which could have, I should emphasize, could have reshaped the face of continental philosophy of biology. A shift of that kind did not take place, although now now and then on and off over the last 20 plus years, calls for versions of organicism are quite common in philosophy of biology. Challenges to genocentric orthodoxy, autopoiesis, morphology, development, organizational closure, all of which are loosely compatible with Canguilhem, although he remains a philosopher making philosophical claims, not a theoretical biologist making empirical claims. It's the endless problem I have when interacting with people who work in theoretical biology. They will sort of say, oh yeah, this is nice, and then proceed to turn it either into formula or at least into kind of like formalized truth claims. And I'm not saying they're not allowed to. I'm just saying what's of interest to me here is not, oh, I have found a definition of life. It's, oh, I'm articulating a philosophical position with regard to questions about life or definitions of life. And indeed, this thing that never really happened as a research program or whatever could yield an existential vitalism, it can yield a more robust relation to the history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, some of his most well-known work, important work, like the work on vital normativity, appears in a new light if we consider it in terms of this biological philosophy he briefly called for in 1947. Merci.
Yeah, standard operating, take 5 minutes. Get a breathe, take a breather.
Do you want more water or coffee? Or?
stony silence.
I don't find it. There you go.
No, but I was hoping the student to talk first,
Okay.
but if not,
So it's more about the details. So you mentioned this Pulitzer guy, and he's clearly in a polemic in this 1947 article. And I was just thinking whether, I mean, he means like one person as his target, or if there has been an established discussion in Francophone literature at the time, or he just sort of extracts this Cartesian reductionist idea from everywhere and criticizes it.
Well, it's a clear and precise question, but in a way it's tricky, because in a way you're operating on two levels at once. Because if it was just a question about the contemporaries, that's a question in itself. It's like, so who does he really mean in terms of this like rationalist, Marxist hostility to philosophy of life? Who does he mean? And the one example that seems obvious, it's undebatable, is Politzer. Politzer has this polemic that Azad knows. He has this really fantastically violent pamphlet from 1929 called Le Bergsonisme, une parade philosophique. Is that the title of it? I think that's the title.
So.
Le Bergsonisme, une parade philosophique. And not exactly in that pamphlet, but in a short thing he published in some very confidential gauchiste newspaper, and also in maybe the early 30s. Politzer has the following wonderful example. He says, so you guys all know durée, right? Bergson, duration, time, durée. Politzer says a pogrom happens in durée and a revolution happens in durée. Bergson has nothing to tell us about the difference between a pogrom and a revolution. So that's an example of
Wow.
Politzer's treatment of Bergson.
Yikes.
And if you guys want hard-headed, not exactly Vienna Circle style, but more Anglo-American macho criticism of willingness style, help yourself to Politzer on Bergson, because there's a lot of that kind of stuff there. It's like Politzer also, in a way that precisely, I guess, Canguilhem doesn't agree with, and in a way very classic for Marxists, hones in on the authority of science and sort of says, is what Bergson's saying useful to biologists? No, therefore it's not useful to us. You know, the sort of Occam's razor of science used by Marxists is all sorts. Anyway, so one could say a number of things about the Politzer and Canguilhem. And by the way, the younger Canguilhem writes very admiringly about Politzer. So somehow, in 1947, Canguilhem has become a kind of philosopher of life, if you want to call it that. And he's a bit hissy about, I want to defend this project in France. Like, you know, all this opprobrium. And then the longue durée, so to speak, you know, the Descartes to now. I mean, it's a very interesting point, including in scholarly terms, to say, oh, Descartes doesn't grant any ontological originality to life. It's true, Descartes says things that kind of match that, but also there's been some work on Descartes in recent, not generations, but in recent 20, 30 years, including, I've done a tiny bit of it, that gives a very different picture of Descartes than what Canguilhem does. The so-called embodied Descartes, Descartes of the passions, Descartes who acknowledges Princess Elizabeth's critiques about how body and soul via the passions are connected. Descartes is obsessed with medicine. Descartes says, la santé is my ultimate object, including prolonging life is my greatest obsession. Descartes' treatise on man, which he didn't publish, it's just another story. Descartes' L'Homme, or Traité de l'Homme, doesn't always fit the bill of what Canguilhem is saying. And another example, but this is not answering your question and just giving random pieces of information. Canguilhem has a book I didn't mention. I quoted from it once, but I didn't mention it. It's a very scholarly looking book. It's his thèse d'état in philosophy to qualify for a professorship in philosophy at the Sorbonne. It's a history of the notion of reflex action in neuroscience. It's actually a kind of interesting, somewhat bold history of the development of neuroscience is what it really is. In that book, Descartes is the bad guy, and Thomas Willis, a natural philosopher from Oxford, roughly slightly after Descartes, is the good guy for the beginning of neuroscience. So Canguilhem, completely not respecting the norms he helped invent for historical epistemology. Canguilhem goes out of his way to say, if neuroscience really went with Descartes, we would never have gotten to A, B, C, D 20th century discoveries. Those discoveries fit with Thomas Willis, which, it's like happily being a presentist about the 17th century, which is not what you were asking about. But what I mean is that there's a very interesting dynamic with regard to Descartes in Canguilhem, which one can also criticize, even historically, but it's a very interesting dynamic. Who else is meant? Probably Giuseppe Bianco could like pop up and say, Charles Wolfe, as always, is too broad and general. There's actually another guy who had published an article in 1928 in December that Canguilhem read because it's in his library. I'd be happy to know. I think the Lukács thing is interesting just because it's such a perfect, it's like the piece of Lego that fits, even if it's not at all what he has in mind. It's not the perfect answer to his article because it behaves much more like the move in the argument before Canguilhem's article. I mean, then one can say, do those people have a point? Well, that's a fair question in itself. And then one can say, can one do justice to the Marxist critique without giving up all Canguilhem? Can you allow for a little bit of, for example, on the issue of vitalism, does the Marxist language exhaust the language? Does the Marxist critique of dangerous, irrationalist, equal vitalism, does that exhaust the topic of vitalism? I would think not, and in that sense, I think one can defend some of what Canguilhem is doing, even if he's being a bit méchant or a bit obsessive with regard to this, the mean Marxist, vilain Marxiste or something. I think there's a pushback or a pro and con there.
Thank you, Charles, for this talk. I really learned a lot, and it was as entertaining as interesting. But, it's not about, sorry. I was thinking, if you're right, and Canguilhem is trying to defend this weak vitalism, just between the dualism, between the monism, something just in the middle of the road, is there any influence of the British emergentists, just a generation before, who has this, they have the same project, but coming from somewhere else? They are really Darwinian, full.
Are they really so? I guess they are. They're what they call emergent evolutionists. Yeah,
they claim. That's what they claim. But they want to. When you said science as a garde-fou, it's really like the British emergentists. It's not reducible. Biology is not. Life is not reducible. But of course, science is the authority. So we have to keep blah blah blah. Everything. The physical law is respected. Blah, blah, blah.
I think it's more like there is a nice paper to be done comparing, because influence
you don't see any.
Is not really the way to go. So he's aware. Or, he sometimes mentions more the another British group of the same time. So the theoretical about them, Haldane, Woodger, Needham, you know, that little group. But now I'm just philosophizing rather than saying there's a influence. He engages with Hegel because some of those people are Hegelians, right, or were Hegelians or are Hegelians. He engages rather interestingly with Hegel, and there's two texts. One which I didn't talk about either of them. One of his most pure philosophy texts, there's not many like that, he has a long article or a long essay called Le Concept et la Vie, which is not yet, it's been translated by friends of mine and they're slow. They translated 2 years ago and I've been telling them, publish it. And I think now they're saying, oh, the Canguilhem family, or not the Canguilhem family, of course, much worse, the Vrins. Vrins, who are infamous for many ways for their behavior. Vrins are blocking. Anyway, so Le Concept et la Vie is his engagement with particularly like Hegel and Aristotle on this question of is the work of the concept itself part of life? And interestingly, Kant kind of falls off the radar at that point because it's a lot of Aristotle and a lot of Hegel. So that would be, if someone said to me, okay, you know, we're going to lock you in a room and give you food and water, and 1 week you have to produce an article on Canguilhem and the British emergentists, I would start from Le Concept et la Vie, since it's his most Hegelian moment. He also has, it's the kind of thing he does fairly often, this kind of weird fake modesty maybe, to conceal a lot of original thought in the form of a review, you know, to sort of do a review of some book and then just pour stuff into it. And he has this piece called Hegel en France, which is technically a kind of a survey of the fact that finally in France, and indeed in the same period as this piece, we're starting to have proper translations and proper books on Hegel, and we were no longer stuck in the mediocre blah, 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 where we were before. But then he puts a lot of philosophical content into this piece. I'm not a big Hegel person. I was mediocre at best as a student, and so I'm now kind of like rusty on top of mediocre. But so A, he's not really influenced by British emergentists. I think it's safe to say. B, does he ever mention any of them? I don't think so, but it's an interesting question to try and look. I have one, or I sadly don't have all the complete in secret PDFs. They're very hard to get, but I have some. C, do they share a little bit of this, that version of anti-reductionism, and indeed those kind of metaphysical leanings? Because part of what's implied in your question is, to what extent is he a metaphysician or not? And the Canguilhem we generally think of is not. It's not just that, he writes historical stuff about Claude Bernard or William Harvey or the germ theory or the cell theory. It's that really he's something like an anti-metaphysician. And so in 1 or 2 or 3 places, he seems a bit more like something like a metaphysician of life. Although, as I said, and you picked up on it, he's very clear that metaphysics of life is not going to be like what Merleau-Ponty does for some serious reasons. It's not going to be classical vitalism for perhaps a similar argument, really, even though Merleau-Ponty would probably say, hey, hang on, I'm not a classical vitalist. But in some sense, it's the same argumentative machine used against both of them. But so, the emergentism, arguably in many of its forms, not just in the early 20th century forms, emergentism is making a kind of strong realist claim about complexity and qualitative shifts and properties and granted more or less ontological episteme, but it's making some kind of claim about the nature of the world. And Canguilhem tends to dance away from doing that, except Le Normal et le Pathologique is a fairly bold book on that sense. It builds itself from within the technical issues within medicine, but it's a fairly bold set of theorizations of vital norms, etc. And so, le concept et la vie is the place where he most engages with the toolbox, the conceptual toolbox of like Hegel, life, etc. Le normal et le pathologique, I would think, is the closest he gets to. It's not a metaphysics of life, but it's an ontology. So, like I was quoting, he clearly thinks what's missing in a lot of these stories. Well, sorry, let me rephrase the sentence. The Merleau-Ponty and classical vitalism are bad for reasons we've seen. On the other end of the spectrum, Descartes and a kind of longue durée Cartesianism, the sin, the faute, or whatever, doesn't grant the ontological originality of life. And so you could sort of come to him and say, oh, okay, so you want the ontological originality of life, but how much? Do you want to go like really far with that? And when he engages with, Monod Jacob, modern biology in the 1950s, 60s, it's an interesting moment because he allows that can falsify or constrain this, whatever you want to call it, philosophy of life. But, this is again going beyond the limits of your question, but most famous sentence, I think, from François Jacob's book, La logique du vivant, Logic of Life, most famous sentence, on n'interroge plus la vie aujourd'hui dans nos laboratoires. We no longer inquire into life today in our laboratories. Canguilhem wrote a review of that book. I'm sad to say I have downloaded, or I've gotten access to it years ago, and I have it. I don't think in his review he directly tries to rebut that statement, because technically you can't rebut it. Because Jacob is in a way modestly saying, look, when we go to our day jobs in labs, whether head of the laboratory or third assistant in a laboratory, life and the nature of life is not what we're seeking to address. We're engaging with, some part of a fruit fly or something like that. And it would be silly of Canguilhem to say like Heidegger saying science does not think. It would be silly of Canguilhem to say, oh, that's false. They don't even know what they're talking about. So he's left in a sort of funny space. He's left in I'm not sure if I want that to be my last words, but he's left in a funny space. And the question of his relationship to something like emergentism will be one of the points in that, one of the coordinates in that space that he's in. It will also have his philosophy of medicine, because again, it's like he has a robust philosophy of medicine. But his philosophy of medicine has something fairly ontological about it, unlike presumably a lot of what's done today in the name of philosophy of medicine. But that's an interesting point.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah, follow up.
And this is also, I also have a follow-up. So
So if Canguilhem, it will be shorter, guys, I hope, but maybe not the answer. But no, thank you. So if you explain clearly that it does not want to commit to be a metaphysician or to claim metaphysical, even if he's claiming some ontological. So is it why you see more a relation to Kant than to Hegel? So in the Kantian version of purpose, intentionality, there's a more line with what Canguilhem is aiming at.
The Kantian point, I had in mind a little bit more the sort of regulative ideal stuff that comes out in the third critique, where in the parts dealing with what is an organism in the third critique, and he doesn't use the word organism, and he uses it in the last work as he's in the process of going insane, Opus Posthumum. When Kant addresses this question of like, how do we do justice to what is an organism, with indeed kind of purposiveness and stuff, but one of the important things he He does, and it's very new, it's very original, I guess, compared to other theories of organism, etc., older or after, is that he insists that there's some kind of degree of construction involved. That it's not like we're listing the properties that make up this object or that object, or if I have a wombat or a dog on the table, that it's just like there are 30 properties that do justice to this and 10 that do, and if I've got a wombat, I need like 100 properties to do justice to the functioning of the wombat. He's saying there's something about the worm or the wombat or me that requires some kind of constructivist, and sometimes I would say existential dimension. It's a way of being. I'm not saying I want to build a whole philosophy out of that, but in the Vitalism essay, when he's finished beating on classical vitalism, he says things about we need a vitalism of experience. And again, it's like, what is that exactly? But I think part of what he means is this idea that it's like, I mean, Uexküll claims to be a Kantian. Uexküll is a very bad philosopher, if I can say so, besides being a bad person politically in other ways. But Uexküll is full of statements about what I'm doing is Kantian, and he seems to think that means the point of view of the subject. And he literally says in, I forget, Introduction to Theoretical Biology or something, it means the centrality of the subject in biology. So yeah, Canguilhem, I think, can be read as a kind of Kantian, particularly in this constructivist way. Does it fit with everything in L'œuvre of Canguilhem? Maybe not, but that's what I meant. So that was my short answer to Alexandre.
Thank you.
And
yes, I had a follow-up just because it rather my first question was Azat's question. My second question, though, echoes actually this, like where you went with the answer to that. Because one thing I was wondering is, and so if you've already said all you had to say about this, you can just say that. But so you mentioned that he sort of gets off of he sort of abandons this biological philosophy concept basically outside the confines of this one essay. So yeah, I just wanted to hear you speculate a little bit more about kind of armed with this reconstruction of this call that he makes in 47, sort of what are your big, what do you think are the most important take-home messages that gives us for how we read the rest of Canguilhem in light of the fact that, well, whether he keeps it or not, or does he abandon it temporarily, or should we read some other stuff that he says in light of the fact that we know that this is a thing that he talks about sometimes? Like, I'm trying to kind of make this, because this is the Canguilhem that I don't know at all. I haven't read this end of his work, and it's like, how do I make this Canguilhem talk to the bits that I have read?
Well, thanks, and I gestured a bit in that direction at some points in the talk, because I was sort of saying, right, so A, the term seems limited in time. B, if we want, we can do what Gaillon did a little bit, and Pradeux did a little bit, and not too many other people have done, as far as I know. I mean, Pierre-Olivier Métaux also has a piece doing some of this, which is a sort of disciplinary reflection on both how philosophy and biology came together, where it's gone since the 1960s, and how there were, and so again, Marjorie Green there suddenly becomes a very big part of the story, or at least, a big figure. That circa 1960s, there's a little bit of competing models, competing narratives for what that will become, what that could become. And indeed, and by the way, the Canguilhem Marjorie Green story is one of those rencontres ratées or whatever, those not very successful. She seems to have skillfully ignored referring to his work for a long time, and then wrote an entire piece very late. It's not a great piece, but that's not the question. They did a special issue on his thought in the, I think he was still alive then, or maybe it's after his death. and she, who was very old at the time, she produced an entire article kind of commenting on the normal and pathological and so forth. And I think Pierre-Olivier has dug up, as he can do, some archival stuff where she like has a letter in the 1950s or 60s saying, I haven't really read that. Because the thing is, they both are major, like they both are the immediate first generation readers of that Germanic stuff. In her case, the whole philosophical anthropology, lebenspphilosophisch. She wrote a whole book, right, called, what was it called? She has a whole book with chapters on the different sort of 20th century German kind of anti-reductionist holist figures. And so it's as if she and Canguilhem have read the same stuff, so Goldstein, for instance. But he embeds it. So going back to the way you put your question, I was kind of saying we could do plenty of interesting reflection in disciplinary terms. Blah, 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 blah. We could continue doing that. Then we could say, okay, what does he do with this project? What do you call it when you're in a law court or something? Exhibit A. Exhibit A, le normal et le pathologique. Le normal et le pathologique fits, in I think some good ways, the bill. It fits the portrait robot, the description of the suspect of what philosophie biologique should be. The fact that it does it in a very technical way, not in this kind of, humans are special and we are not worms and all that. The fact that it builds it from proper medicine is just all the more, dare I say, ballsy, courageous of Canguilhem. So I think in a few big ways it fits the book. A second instance is that his historical epistemology work, and Foucault makes this point in his essay on Canguilhem, he sort of says, okay, Canguilhem, Bachelard, Cavaillès, whatever, they're the giant figures of this thing called epistemology. And then at a certain point he says, Canguilhem, however, is the one who decided to turn away from the safe, prestigious part of history and philosophy of science, the sort of Galileo, Newton, Kepler, the kind of mathematical, mechanical, physical sciences. And he turned from that to the life sciences, which you might say, okay, well, that's true, and technically that's just a kind of, it's like instead of studying lines and solids, I decided to study bonobos or whatever. It's just a change of object. Foucault says, I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, but he sort of says, no, there's a kind of ontological weight that goes with this change, because you're studying the world of chance. I don't think he specifically refers to Darwinian things, but you could plug in a certain amount of Dennett and Dewey on Darwin right there. You're studying a world of variation and chaos and so forth, rather than, granted, some people say, physics in the 20th century isn't all about ordinary, safe, regular things, but Foucault puts some emphasis on this idea that you're studying a world of monsters, strange births, and all that stuff. And that has some sort of ontological impact. And there you get, and I think this does continue to answer your question, you get sides of Canguilhem that some of us might not want to put forth in, whether it's like a job talk, if we were trying to get a job, or a job talk for Canguilhem, as in, if I wanted to defend Canguilhem's legitimacy with Kim Sterelny and not Paul Griffiths, who's already a bit of a hybrid, but a certain kind of normative philosophers of biology, normative, mainstream, orthodox philosophers of biology, I wouldn't want to say, you know what, he's a Nietzschean, and he says he's a Nietzschean, and he says life is anarchic like an artist. But so that side of Canguilhem, I think, fits with this idea of what it means to turn to the biological world, the biological sort of spectrum of things. To us, that might seem like a bit of a funny consequence to derive, but that's why I spent what may have seemed like a lot of time in the beginning of this paper or this talk. I spent a fair bit of time on how he is and is not like a sort of lebenspphilosophisch or romantic philosopher of life, including in the 20th century sense thereof. So in some ways, and again, the Marjorie Green comparison fits there, he's right there in the, you know, I'm dialoguing with science, but I want something else than what a certain kind of science is dictating to us. So in some ways, it's like he's right there in a parallel universe of some of the more Germanic, romantic philosophers of life. But with regard to genetics, with regard to Darwinism, with regard, well, I don't know what to call it, but with regard to the fact that he sometimes also insists on, so I think it's in the Aspect du Vitalism paper, he says, the world of values and something of humans has no more objective worth than the world of values of, and it's great, he says, le cloporte ou la souris grise. So the what is that called in English? Those small, prehistoric-looking gray insects that roll into a ball that you find under stones, or you know,
a pill bug.
Pillbug.
Well,
there must be lots of idiomatic names.
that name is highly regional. Yes. A
roly-poly. Yeah, that's the one I actually knew. So right, it says the world of values of the roly-poly or the gray rat or mouse are just as meaningful as the world of values of the human. Well, so biological philosophy fits, I think, with some specific aspects of his program. Then in a funny way, it doesn't unfit with the more, because the safe thing to say is, oh, there's a historicist side of his work. It's rigorous and it's historicist. And a philosopher of life is not a historicist. A philosopher of life is, including in a sort of embarrassing way, you know, in a sort of Bergsonian way, whatever, is like telling you about things. And so you could say he has a foot in each, and he kind of brilliantly sometimes dances between each. Or you could say there's a grand synthesis. I mean, late in life, he doesn't seem to care. He's free and sovereign, and so Le Cerveau et la Pensée, not a very good paper, but it's clear, is a late paper, which is an attack on neuro stuff and saying, it's in some ways a shoddier version of the psychology essay from 10, 20 years earlier, which is a really intriguing, possibly dated, but really intriguing critique of psychology. And that, well, one could say to the question of how does the category of biological philosophy fit or not fit with his work overall, one could add, so I've enumerated like 2-3 things. I could say the sort of humanistic side, which you get in certain papers full on, including the psychology essay, where it's like, this is a pseudoscience trying to dictate what people should be like, as it were. You could say, something in the philosophie biologique piece has a little bit of that. It's like, I'm not going to let une biologie fascinée par le prestige des sciences physico-chimiques tell me what to do. Parenthesis, just a bonus information for you guys, since the book isn't out yet, and nothing to do with me. It's a very interesting book that has nothing to do with me. There's someone called Valentine Prouvé, who's I'm not sure why the book isn't out yet, but it's supposed to come out in the last 6 or 9 months. It's the first book on Canguilhem and Freud. Well, it's the first book I'm aware of. She's done a lot of archival work, and she's found an interesting thing. He very rarely mentions Freud. And in interviews says, I know very little about that. My student, and so I think Laplanche was one of his students, says my students have very kindly sent me the complete works that they've edited and translated over the years, so I own that. And she found, from much earlier on, massively annotated stuff with Freud and all that. So there's the Romantically Pathological calls out for also being reread with that kind of call it archival, manuscript knowledge. So a Belgian guy called Daled, Pierre-Frédéric Daled, who is based in Brussels, I guess, and wrote this long, let's just say long book about Canguilhem that I did read a year or two ago. The really surprising thing that I gained from that book is that in the early 40s, Canguilhem, I think he and I was confused them, Lagache, not Laplanche, Lagache, are both giving seminars in one of those like wartime universities, Strasbourg, which had moved to Clermont-Ferrand because Strasbourg had been taken over by the Germans. And Lagache is doing sort of psychiatry seminars. And I think their relations got bad subsequently, and I think Lagache did something semi-disgraceful towards the end of the war. I can't remember exactly what it was. At least some kind of cowardice. But Daled sort of says, here's the interesting thing. Psychiatry is never mentioned in Le Normal et le Pathologique, but the whole matrix, the whole grille de lecture of Le Normal et le Pathologique has something very psychiatric about it. That's another like interesting little thing for, well, what it means in 2025 to read some of those books that most people tend to just do hagiographical paraphrasing of, it's like how great they are or how irrelevant they are. I mean, in answer to no question here, Michel Morange has a paper in which he says, Canguilhem is lovely and great and did a lot, and we owe him a lot of credit, but it's caduc, it's dated, as in modern life science has just left all that stuff behind, which can put that in your judgment too.
I think Max had a question.
You can move for my question is a historical one, but how was this text, the note, received? Did someone reply to it? Like George Politzer is dead, obviously, but someone else did ask him, has there been answers?
It's a very good question. I've never seen. Okay, I'm going to write that one down. I've never seen particular response to it. I mean, it was before I gave the talk today, there were some funny anecdotal comments, not from me, about Gilbert Simondon. Very, very inappropriate stories being told, again, not by me. I think Simondon was his student, maybe did his thesis with him or something like that. And there's an interesting, this is a sort of glissement of answering the question. Philosophie biologique has a little bit of a life, I'm not sure if it's a second life or first life, not that long after the article. So let's say late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s, you have Simondon and the guy whose name should be pronounced not as one thinks, so not Rouillet, but Bruyère, I believe you're supposed to say Raymond Bruyère, who was perhaps legitimately forgotten until Deleuze started quoting him in the 60s, 70s, and then everything Deleuze quotes has to have a moment in the sun. They're both somehow in the orbit of Canguilhem. I mean, Simondon literally is some kind of student. Rouillet in relations, I'm not sure the exact biographical relations, but I think Canguilhem adds references to them when he rewrites or redevelops the Normal et le Pathologique. He plugs in some, so where there was just Goldstein at certain points, Rouillet and Simondon are sort of coming in. And you could say that that Canguilhem, in his own kind of complicated way, because he has his feet in different doors or whatever, and Rouillet and Simondon in their own ways are practicing this. And so full honesty, I've never read, and I should, but the clock is ticking. Someday I'll read it. The Ruyer's book on, Simondon's book on technique. I read and spent lots of time, and now no longer read it, but l'individu et sa genèse physico-biologique. Physico-biologique. And that book is very much something like the philosophie biologique that's being called for, because it's a strong engagement in science, but it's taking it in individuation, as far as I know, isn't what any of those sciences were themselves saying they need to be contributing to. It's like, I'm going to pull the theory of individuation out of them. But so, concretely, did anyone reply to Note sur la situation faite à la philosophie biologique? If I'm trying to just imagine, if I think like, okay, who mentions Canguilhem at all and when? And so you start to get more stuff a bit later on. And then he has this kind of prestige of the epistemologue. So people are like, mentioned usually with great respect. And so, Deleuze does, Foucault in a very strong way does. And various sort of actors on the intellectual scene. But by that time, it's later, and they're not asking questions like, you have this weird paper from 1947, does that fit with your work? They're just sort of allowing the aura of l'épistémologue. And indeed, there's a lot of earlier stuff by Canguilhem that it's as if he swept it under the rug. Not because it's legitimately shameful, but he has all these pacifist writings. He has a whole treatise that he co-authored with a really forgotten guy called Camille Planet, who was a good friend of his, and who failed to get a PhD accepted. Like, they refused his PhD at the Sorbonne, and the guy never had an academic career. And I think he taught high school for a few years, and then just kind of the same, like, small town they were both from, Castelnaudary, an hour from Toulouse. I think Planet went back into like the family business of like shoemaking or something like that, seriously. But so Camille Planet and Canguilhem co-authored not just a book, a treatise called Traité de logique et de morale, of which 2 volumes out of 3 were published. So you can find them, and they're in the œuvre complète now. Volume 3, which didn't come into being, was supposed to be on psychology. And that's an entire other. It's not just he co-authored a book with a guy, and it's a whole other strata of his thought, because it's axiology, and so all this business about theory of values, and so some of that is there in the Normale Pathologique. It's like, what is a value for the obese person? What is a value for the cloporte, et cetera, but that was like this full and not very scientifically contextualized. And I think Planet was really influenced by some French philosopher. I've forgotten the name of, whose like life's thing was doing théorie des valeurs. I can't remember what the guy was called. But so, simple answer, I've never noticed any reference to the article, and it's an interesting question, and I would like to maybe find if there was something, and I guess I'll have to go back to Giuseppe Bianco again to see if he found anything. Second answer, the project does kind of have that moment, and I didn't say it in the talk, but the very first version of this I ever did, like 10, 15 years ago, spent more time on how in the 50s and early 60s, there's a few people, not just Revue, Simondon, Canguilhem, but there's this kind of strong focus on the history and philosophy of life science in France in that period, in a somewhat anti-reductionist way. Again, different from the more Germanic blah 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 way. And so there's that, et cetera, et cetera. And then I started saying, in the end, people's response to Canguilhem, it's kind of like he becomes the guy of one book, so to speak, and or he becomes, again, l'épistémologue who has, participated in groundbreaking conferences on Cuvier and, this kind of stuff. And so at that point, no one... So if someone comes along in 1990 or 2000 and says Canguilhem is a Nietzschean, at first it's like, whoa, what are we talking about here? He's never published something like that. He's a respectable scholar. I mean, seriously, like he's a scholar, he's a contextualist, he's not a... And he has this very funny phrase in an interview with Michel Fichon. He says, "Je suis un Nietzschéen sans carte," which I guess is a joke about the Communist Party, since in France, encarté, do you have your party card? It's not, doesn't 100 parties, it means a specific party. And so I guess he's again kind of being a bit provocative, because it's like, I'm a Nietzschean, and Nietzscheans, as you don't need to be reminded, have a mixed political reputation at best. But he's saying, I don't have a membership card in that party. And again, way beyond your question, the Marx
just
stuff.
a question. This interview is around when?
Mm-hmm.
This interview where he still says I'm Nietzschean is around when? Just before you continue. Pretty late.
The interview is late.
Okay, that's interesting.
The interview is relatively late. Okay, you want to be really precise, I can tell you a text I haven't mentioned, and it's not called Nietzsche's Views About Life. It's not a text on Nietzsche, but he has a text, I think, equally or less well known, than Note sur la situation faite à la philosophie biologique. He has a text in a Festschrift, Mélange and homage to Hippolyte, a great French Hegelian of the time. By the way, that Festschrift is a treasure trove for intellectual historians of French thought of the time, because who is in it is really weird. The Bataille has one of the weirdest pieces he ever wrote is in that volume. It's called Hegel, Death, and Sacrifice. I don't understand almost any line in that text. It's intriguing, but it's really like, it's a mysterious text. And like a bunch of very interesting people are present in this Festschrift for Hippolyte. Canguilhem has a piece called De la science et de la contre-science. It's quite abstract. It's a sort of reflection on science and truth. It's a nice, weird piece of pure philosophy of science, like really, I would say it's something like pure philosophy of science. And if you sort of look at it, it has all this stuff about science and the production of truth, and possibly things like the vital production of truth. It looks a lot like Nietzsche. So, but no, so I don't think he's one of these like young, crazy Nietzscheans in his youth. I think Canguilhem is too unusual for that. I think in some ways, the relevant stuff is later. But no, in my monologue before Alexandre brutally intervened, all I was adding is that the relation to Marx is a really good example of something that got buried, which is to say, I was making the general point to you that you get a kind of statut du commandeur, whatever, you get a kind of famous representative figure that is, kind of famous throughout the world in intellectual specialized circles. And you don't get much behind that figure. In the case of Canguilhem, it's very little known. Because there are people who might say, this is my fourth book, and in the introduction to my fourth book I say, Lukács spends a lot of time doing this, for example. I was wrong in 1925. I wrote a book in 1925, and the introduction to this book is to make it clear to you, dear reader, that I was wrong 20 years ago. So, some people shine the light a bit, including in strange manipulative ways, but they shine the light on what they were doing 20 years before. Canguilhem doesn't particularly do that. And so the Marx stuff is it's like no one noticed it. And so now, it's not me by myself. Henning Schmidgen, with someone who I think is a student of his, just published a year ago an article in Theory, Culture, and Society, in which he sort of goes over 5 long review essays by Canguilhem in the 1920s, 30s, and shows like this idea of you might say a mildly vitalist theory of labor, living labor. Labor is part of precisely not the kind of mechanistic or mechanized side of humans or nature, but this life. Sorry, that was beyond the answer.
Well, my question was whether, because it feels like he's in between in this text between sort of vitalism and reductionism, and he wants to try to find some middle ground. And so my question was a bit what you just went into now, of sort of whether I saw it as he's trying to find an alternative to dialectical materialism, and sort of, I don't know, from the history that you said right at the beginning, he was a sort of admiring Pulitzer in his early years. That's, I guess, the 1930s or so. Then he seems to try to find this alternative to Marxism here in 1947, early days of Cold War, the beginning of anti-communism, and then sort of 1977, reviving the interest in Marxism in general, and then he publishes this ideology, rationalité, gesture to look at. I know this is a bit reductionist and simplistic, but whether we see this historical trajectory of sort of coming and going, and as I said, sort of hiding a bit the Marxist undertones, precisely to look not Marxist, especially in 1947.
Okay, interesting, and I hadn't thought of it that way, but so let me just ask you, so why would he, so yeah, I don't think it's a Cold War thing, but let's say, like, if it is, why in 1977 suddenly get Marx so friendly? Like, what's happening to make that more legitimate in 1977? So I'm just saying, if you're gonna manage to tie it to a kind of conjoncture, as they would say, and say, the 20s, 30s, it makes sense because the political situation is X. In 1947, the politico-economic situation is Y. Then it's like, why the ideology stuff in the 70s? It's not like everyone, I mean, you might say that's when the birth of the first real abandonment of Marxism is happening. So, that, I'm not sure how well that works. However, since you mentioned, and I skipped over it for the purpose of the talk, that there's, a total of at least a solid page against dialectical materialism in the 1947 paper. I don't think he ever says anything good about that. And of course, in later stuff, he can bring up the Lysenkism scandal. He can, like most sensible people, he can sort of mention that as a problem. So, but since you mentioned dialectical materialism, here's a funny thing, and I don't really know what to do with this. It's something I've been noting and worrying at for a year or two. If you look at the Haldane and Needham, those kinds of people, there's, as you probably know, there's a point in which they convert, like it's a religious conversion, they convert to dialectical materialism. And then it's funny because you read those passages in their books. I guess Needham more sophisticated and Haldane less, but it's, what am I trying to say? it's this kind of big framework, and it doesn't really affect how they're doing their science. They claim that it's the true framework, but it's not particularly affecting how they're doing their scientific work. Like Whitehead, by the way, as people here I'm sure know very well, there's that not weird, but there's that infatuation with Whitehead at a certain point by some of those very respectable biologists. And I remember sitting in a room in a conference that Gaillon gave a nice talk about Whitehead and British biologists in 1920s, 30s. And I raised my hand at the end and said, like, so is there any relation between the Whitehead stuff and their science? And it's as if I asked, a vulgar question or something. It's just like, no. But by the way, do you know Antonine Nicoglou?
I am, yeah.
I am not that there was much ambiguity, but I'm not Antonine Nicoglou, therefore I've seen her do this, and I couldn't do it, and I possibly wouldn't do it. I'm not going to deliver 15 minutes of my lecture as an imitation in the voice of Jean Gaillon. The last time I started to give a lecture, she did 15 minutes, not 1 minute, but 10, 15 minutes. And it's like, nous pourrions dire que... It was unbelievable, and some of the people in the room whose sense of humor was not the best anyway, I won't name names, were just kind of like in stony silence. It was amazing, sorry. What's really funny is that Needham in particular, on the same page, without seeming to notice problems, will be like, Whitehead, that's the true picture of like kind of how the cosmos works. Dialectical materialism, that's also completely true. In fact, they're saying the same thing. And then it's like I continue doing my molecular biology work. But so some of the content of what dialectical materialism seems to be about for them is organicism, which no one seems to have made this sort of obvious observation. And it's funny because organicism has other murky political associations, whether fair or not fair. So it's funny that in the end, all they mean by dialectical materialism is stuff like, the law of the quantity to quality, and qualitative shifts from quantitative, these things. I'm not saying they're silly and it's false. I'm saying things that Canguilhem might be mildly interested in, but which would presumably push him in a more metaphysical direction, which is to say a kind of theory of everything where you've got, levels of this and more complex levels of that. Something he doesn't do very much, but which he seems congenial to or well disposed to with regard to what is an organism. You could have taken him and say, calm down, you're indeed dealing with somewhat dogmatic members of the party in the country you're in at the time you're in, but take a cold shower or have a ginger ale and come back to the table and look at how dialectical materialism isn't that different than some of the things you get from Hegel and you get from so forth. So there are funny things to be done there, but his politics, like his actual politics, I daren't even, because I think he kept it relatively close secret, as it were. It's rumored that he's not always, he's not far on the left, but like his support for Foucault is a really beautiful thing, because if you think about it seriously, whatever we think of Foucault now, or if it's, I don't use it, especially in my work and so forth, but Foucault is a very fragile, not psychologically, but also institutionally. For the first chunk of his career, he's a very fragile person. He's doing things no one has done. He's writing about very strange objects. People weren't writing Histoire de la Folie all the time, at the time. Canguilhem, it's not just that he supported him, which is already non-negligible. He wrote really emphatic essays on the work of Foucault. And if you look at those essays, and you again look at Le Normal et le Pathologique, you get a very anarchistic picture. You get a picture devoted to destroying the idea of norm. Not just, because at first, you look at Le Normal et le Pathologique and you look at the commentaries and it's like, oh, in life and in the life of the organism, mere mechanical reductive schemes don't do justice to what normativity is. You get this sort of soft philosophy of medicine from it that gets repeated a lot, like some, maybe in France especially. But then you kind of look closer, and there's something quite aggressive happening. And so I'm saying, if you put it with, for example, those texts on Foucault, well, you certainly get a vision of someone who's not your garden variety conservative. Then it becomes a kind of plus and minus question. But the relation to Marx, since you began with that point, it is a genuinely interesting issue. It's not just here he's quite hostile, and in 4 or 5 long review pieces in the 20s, 30s, he's quite positive, and then in the 70s he's in a different way quite positive. It's like in Machine et Organisme, which is not an unknown essay. It's one of the big essays in La Connaissance de la Vie, together with the Vitalism one, the Milieu, the Monsters, and stuff. Machine et Organisme has a 1.5 page engagement with Grossman, Borkenau, Hessen, the Marxist analyses of the emergence of modern technology and modern science. And he's quite fluent in it. And he's not at all saying, all this stuff is ideological and bad. He's sort of saying, in the sort of 3 different kind of sub-debate within the Marxist historiography of science, I think so-and-so is right and so-and-so is wrong. So there's a decent, there's a paper to be written, is one way to put it, but there's a decent dossier that compiled on how he relates to, although I'm thinking out loud in answering to you, this organologie générale, like, again, what do we do with that?
I was going to ask if whether he's talking about development here. He's talking about development of the organism in that sense.
No, I think he seems to be, I don't know if it's in the, because I gave a sort of short version of the quote of the passage. He seems to be talking about, like, no, it's not. It might be in the long version of, of my paper, and it's in his article. He actually alludes, and okay, I really like Canguilhem, and here I'm about to compare him to a philosopher I really don't like. You're forcing me to do something really terrible or something. It's a little bit like a certain German philosopher's essay on technology from the early 60s, where that person says, today the USSR and the USA are the dominant powers, and they are both technological powers. We in Germany have the possibility to go a different way and to steer away from this predominance of technology and so forth. The organologie générale thing, I think, sounds a little bit like that, in the sense that and he alludes, he does, so Canguilhem explicitly alludes to the war that's just ended and to the tension. So actually there is a Cold War reference. I'm saying it. He sort of says, and now we're moving into a different kind of, I forget the term he uses, but he basically says, we've just come out of a very big war, and now we're moving into a kind of a different form of confrontation. He alludes to it elegantly without saying Cold War. And he says both the confrontation we've just come out of and the thing we're moving into are characterized by this kind of, I forget how he phrased it, but sort of civilization of the machine. And thus, this organologie générale is supposed to somehow offer another way. So no, he's not talking about the organism's development. He's sort of saying, if we are organicists on a big scale, it might help us in civilizational ways. And like I said, I'm not sure in detail what that's supposed to mean, and he didn't, to to my knowledge. I mean, I was saying, does he continue or not the project of biological philosophy? And I gave some examples of how one could fill in some blanks. Organologie générale, the closest thing that I can see is a kind of ecological approach, which is how the German philosopher that I didn't name brilliantly conceals his wartime, not just wartime activities, but conceals the intellectual dimension of his wartime activities by sort of saying, oh, we need to be ecologists. Wow, I can't believe, I didn't see that one coming. I've maneuvered myself into like Canguilhem and Heidegger as the same philosopher.
That makes us all need a beer, I think, so we can take this beer.